Well, welcome to week number 3 in the completion of our series, Lasting Love. We've been focused on relationships and been talking to you about the kinds of things you need to do to make relationships last, to make them rich. And I want you to be clear that on this, our world is a broken place. If you learned anything this last week from that shooting in Florida, it's that a lot of people are broken in our world. A lot of people need Jesus' help. And I will say this, that when it comes to good relationships that last, that are rich, that are life-giving, it's possible to have relationships like that, but it's not probable. In order for you and me to become the kinds of people who can have relationships that last and that are vital and that make our life worth living, we need to be changed. The things I've been talking about in these weeks and that our guest speakers spoke about last week, these are not things that come naturally to us. These are things that take a change of mind and heart that God makes in us. In Romans chapter 12, it talks about a change like this. These are words that you and I need to hear today as we set our sights again on relationships. Don't copy the behavior and customs of this world, but let God transform you. You and I, we need some change in the way that we think, in the way that we approach others. And he says, can we go back one slide, please? He says, into a new person. Let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. So there's something that has to change up here. Then you will learn to know what God's will is for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect. The way that you come to discover God's will for the relationships in your life, it's by letting God change who you are. Today, what I want to focus on on this last message is about how to influence people like Jesus did. Jesus had relationships with people where they loved him and became so incredibly loyal to him, they laid their lives down for him. Nearly all the disciples laid their lives down for Jesus because they came to love him so deeply. And why is that? It's because of the kind of influence that he had on others. Now, the thing is about influence, our world that needs changing, we that need changing, we don't always approach relationships from a point of view that's concerned about influencing others toward good. But instead, we can bring worldly influence to our thinking about relationships. What does that look like? Well, worldly influence, first of all, it comes with this attitude: I must protect. And particularly when you've been hurt in relationships, I must protect becomes kind of like a very normal way for you to think. Once you've been hurt, sometimes it's easy to say, well, I'm not going to let that happen again. I'm going to build a wall. I'm going to make sure that I don't get hurt in this situation again. But the thing is, as we build walls, our influence with others goes down. A second attitude of worldly influence is this: I must benefit. Many people are approaching relationships to think about how that relationship can make them happy or make their life better or open doors for them or whatever it is. And the thing is, if you're approaching the relationships that especially are closest to you in your life with a benefit mentality, what you're going to get out of it, it's most certainly not going to turn out very well. A third attitude of worldly influence is this: I must control. And the thing is, if control is really integral to your relationships with most of the people in your life, controlling what they think, controlling what they say, controlling decisions that you're making together, those relationships will never become rich and full. In fact, if you're trying to control your spouse, for example, if you're constantly interrupting them. You're constantly trying to get them to go your way and do what you think should be done. That's a poison for that relationship. But where we maybe see this most often is in relationships with children, particularly with adult children. Those of you who've been around long enough to have adult children, you know what I'm talking about when I say that sometimes people try to keep their relationships with their kids just by controlling them. If you don't do this, I'll cut you off. If you do such and such, there's no more relationship between us. And the truth is, it's true when a kid is young, and it's true when that child is an adult. If control is at the center of the relationship, that relationship will wither and fade and die. If your relationship is all about getting that other person to do what you think they should do, it's ultimately not going to go anywhere. What should a relationship with a child be like? If it's not about control, it's about concern for seeing that child change in their heart, to be transformed themselves, to want for themselves what's right and what's good. That doesn't necessarily come from controlling another person. Another worldly attitude about influence is this: it's that I must win. In other words, you come to every single relationship, and really what's in your mind is that you're going to win. You're going to win the argument. You're going to win the favor of that other person. Your way is going to win. You know what I've noticed about salesmen? The very best salesmen are the ones who sincerely seem concerned with helping you to win, not the other way around. You know, the thing is about all these attitudes that are the wrong attitudes, they are easy to arrive at given the nature of who we are as people, but also these kinds of attitudes are natural to arrive at when you've been hurt by someone else. And what I think is fascinating about the Gospels in the story of Jesus is that we are shown that Jesus had disappointment with people. We're shown that Jesus was hurt by others on more than one occasion. And in fact, I just want to demonstrate it today through talking to you some about the relationship between Jesus and Peter, who's probably his closest friend on earth, one of his disciples. He becomes the leader of the disciples. And what we learn as we look at the story of Peter is this principle, that every person is a mixed bag. In other words, with Peter, there were some great things about him, but also with Peter, there were some real flaws about him. And you know what? That's true of every person in your life. That's true of you. There's some amazing things about you. And there are some things about you that stink. They need to be thrown out. Now, don't say amen for somebody else. Say it for yourself. But so what kinds of things does Peter and Jesus, what does their relationship bring out about how people are mixed bags? First of all, look at this. People may disappoint. We find this in the story of Jesus and Peter in a number of ways. That Peter disappoints Jesus. And I want you to understand this. It's kind of normal to be disappointed with other people sometimes. That's supposed to happen. That happens from time to time. You're going to be disappointed with everybody. And in the story of Jesus and Peter, one of the ways that it happens is one night the disciples are out on a boat, they're fishing, and Jesus comes walking across the water. At first the disciples look and they're freaked out and they think it's a ghost. And they're like, hide, everybody be quiet. And then they realize it's Jesus. And then Peter says, Jesus, if that's you, let me come out on the water to you. And so Jesus gets out and he starts walking across, or Peter gets out on the water and he starts walking across the water to Jesus. There's this storm going on in the background. Peter turns his eyes to the storm. He starts to feel afraid and he starts to sink and he calls out, Jesus, save me. And so Jesus reaches down and he pulls Peter up. The Bible doesn't talk about it, but think about it. They walked back to the boat together. Amazing. But what happened? He pulls him up, and this is what Jesus said to Peter. Listen to the disappointment in what he had to say. He says, why did you doubt me? Why did you doubt me? Jesus was feeling some disappointment with Peter. Something else we learned from Peter, and that's a general principle about people you need to be aware of, and that's true because people are mixed bag. It's this: people may make mistakes. People may make mistakes. Peter, he does this in a number of ways, but one of the ways that Peter makes a mistake is he argues with Jesus. Let me just tell you, when you argue with Jesus, you lose every time. And so in this one case, Jesus, he's talking about how he's telling the disciples for the first time he's going to be killed. He's going to go into Jerusalem, and the religious leaders are going to turn on him. They're going to kill him. And Peter is standing there, and he's thinking, I've seen what you can do. We don't have to worry about that. And he starts to tell Jesus, Jesus, it doesn't need to be like this. That's not going to happen. And then Jesus turns to Peter, and he says this. He says, get behind me, Satan. How many know you made a mistake when Jesus is calling you the devil? So he says, get behind me, Satan. You're a stumbling block to me. Peter made a mistake. Peter was obviously on the wrong side of the truth and of Jesus. Another way that we see in Peter that's true of people generally being a mixed bag, people are selfish. People are selfish. People normally go to what is going to make them happy, to their own interests. Maybe you've been in a relationship with somebody that you love deeply or that you thought that you could count on, to discover that in the moment of your greatest need, they were just like thinking about themselves. I bet you've had an experience like that with a person or two in your life. That's the experience that Jesus had with Peter, and in fact, the rest of the disciples. The night that Jesus was betrayed, the day before he's crucified, they celebrate this beautiful meal together, the feast of the Passover. They go to the Garden of Gethsemane, and as they're there praying, Jesus says to them, hey, pray with me for 1 hour, guys, just 1 hour. They go to pray. Jesus, he's at like the worst point of his life. The Bible says he was so tormented by the pressure that he was under, he began to sweat drops of blood. And he turns around, and his disciples, and even his best friend Peter, asleep. And this is what Jesus said to him. Simon, he said to Peter, are you asleep? Couldn't you keep watch for 1 hour? Do you see the disappointment and the selfishness of Peter, the disappointment of Jesus and the selfishness of Peter? People will disappoint. People are selfish. Every person you know is selfish in some way. One other thing I want to mention about people being a mixed bag and that we see in Peter, people might betray. People might betray. What I'm getting at here is that sometimes you come to the end of a relationship when you realize that somebody that you counted on deeply has betrayed you. And that happened between Peter and Jesus. It's devastating what happens to Jesus and to Peter. You may know that Jesus tells Peter at that last meal that they were sharing together, Jesus says to him, hey, you're going to deny me 3 times before the cock crows. So Peter says, that'll never happen. Jesus is arrested there in the Garden of Gethsemane. He's taken away. The disciples, for the most part, they run for their lives. Peter stays close enough to be near the house where Jesus is on trial. And as Peter's out there warming his hands by the fire and he's watching this sham of a trial go on, in the middle of the night, people start to come to Peter and ask him if he knows if he knows Jesus, and he says he doesn't. And the third time this happened, this little girl comes up to him, a servant girl, and it says that he began to call down curses, Peter did. He started swearing to them, I don't know this man you're talking about. And right as he was saying those words, the rooster started to crow. And in the book of Luke, it says Jesus turned and looked at Peter. And Peter, it says, he went off and he wept bitterly. It may have felt to him like it was the end of the relationship, that it was over, that he was caught. But something I want you to know about Peter and Jesus, I want you to see this. Jesus didn't cut things off with Peter when he was disappointed. This wasn't the end of the relationship. And let me just make it even clearer for you. If you are in a frame of reference in your life where you are burning the bridge with people on a regular basis, people who you had a relationship with, and you're ending it forever, you're never going to influence like Jesus like that. If you're going to influence others, it's going to require a completely different point of view. It's going to require a different way of thinking about others and about your relationships than the way you've been going at it. And I just say this, if we allow the problems of past relationships to determine how we handle the potential of future ones, we will limit or even eliminate our influence. Now, as bad as it got here, when he's calling down curses on himself and claiming he's never met this Jesus that he walked on water with, as bad as it got here, Jesus didn't give up on Peter. Maybe you didn't come to church for anything else today, but to hear this. Jesus doesn't give up on people. Jesus hasn't given up on you. Jesus doesn't write people off. Jesus doesn't burn the bridge. He is the bridge. Jesus, he demonstrates some extraordinary influence in Peter's life. Of course, Peter's influence with Jesus, it's the relationship of his life. It sets Peter's whole life in a different course than he ever would have imagined. Jesus demonstrates some extraordinary influence in Peter's life. And I want you to see what Jesus saw in Peter in spite of his mistakes and problems. When in the middle of Peter's story, of course, Jesus, he knows everything Peter's going to do. He knows all the ways that Peter will disappoint him and argue with him. He knows about Peter's selfishness. He knows about Peter's tendency to shoot his mouth off. He knows all these shortcomings about Peter. Jesus does. And in the middle of the story of the Gospels, look at what Jesus says about Peter. Because he looks past all those things. And he says this to him. He says, I say to you, you're Peter, which means rock. His name had been Simon. That's why we call him Simon Peter. And upon this rock, I will build my church. Peter, I know all the ways you're going to let me down. Peter, I see the person that you are and all of your pathetic weaknesses. But Peter, you're the one for me. Peter, on this rock, I'm going to build my church, and all the powers of hell will not conquer it. What's going on here? How is it that Jesus could see past the moment of his greatest disappointment? Do you know? This is what Jesus does. He looks at relationships with us, and when he sees us at our worst, he believes the best. And you know, that kind of attitude, that's the kind of attitude I need to bring into every relationship in my life, particularly to those who are closest to me. So that when my spouse or my child or my daughter or son-in-law or my grandchild or whoever it is or my parent lets me down, I'm going to believe the best anyway. It's what love does. It's the way that you build a relationship that will last through hard times. So how can you influence like Jesus? I want to point out one other passage to you. John 21. It's the last time Jesus and Peter, one of the last times they're together, certainly the last direct conversation. And it says the third time he asked him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He'd asked, this is the third time he's asked him, just like Peter had denied Jesus 3 times. Jesus is asking Peter, hey, do you love me? Third time. Peter was hurt that Jesus had asked the question a third time. Like he's thinking he doesn't believe me because he knows the way that I denied him just weeks ago. He said, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. And Jesus said, then feed my sheep. Do you see what's happening there? Do you see what's happening? Jesus, he's getting ready to leave. And he's saying, Peter, I know how you let me down. But I'm going to ask you to do what only I could do. I'm going to ask you to feed my sheep. I'm going to ask you to take care of the believers. Peter, I see something better in you right now than what you and I see right now. And it says this. It says that, he says, feed my sheep. And that's what Peter goes on to do. Peter goes on to lead the church. These other guys that Jesus was in relationship with, they remain committed to him to the death. They give everything for Jesus. Why? How was it that Jesus had influence like that? How was it that Jesus built relationships that endured the most fiery tests that could come? I want to talk to you in my closing statements today just about how to focus. How to influence like Jesus. And I just want you to realize this about influence and about success in life and success in relationships. It's this: your influence is not determined by your level of success, but by your ability to help others succeed. That's how Jesus' relationships developed the kind of quality that they did. And if you, in every relationship, particularly it's true in the marriage relationship, but it's involved in every family relationship and even in every business relationship, you can take this principle everywhere with you in life. Your influence, it's got nothing to do with the fact that you're a bag of chips and something else. Your influence in life is based on your ability to help others succeed. Listen, you want to influence like Jesus? What kinds of things do you need to do? Well, first of all, you need to focus on the other person. Focus on the other person. Look how Philippians 2 says it there. It's in your notes. Don't be selfish. Don't try to impress others. Be humble. Thinking of others as better than yourselves. These are hard things to do, but they're really quite simple. He says, don't look out only for your own interests, but take an interest in others too. You want to influence others? You want to get incredible loyalty from your spouse? Then focus on them first. You want to get incredible loyalty from your kids? Then look out for their needs first. The people who have influenced me in my life, I've thought about this week. The people who've influenced me greatly in my life, there are 5 of them that I could think of, 5 men who influenced my life profoundly when I was a teenager. The way that they did it is they consistently took time and energy and opportunity that they could have been doing other things, and they invested it into me. You want to become a person of influence? You've got to start focusing on other people and not just your own happiness. Second, a way you influence like Jesus is to focus on their positives. Focus on their positives. I see a number of you here today who work with JC Kids, one of our ministries here that reaches out to neighborhood kids. And right now, a lot of those kids, they have a lot of negatives going on in their life. Maybe some real static at home. Maybe a profound lack of resources. Maybe like they don't know who their parents are. But the way that ministry is effective year after year after year is because the people leading it are focusing on the positives of the kids who come. They're not thinking about the negatives. They're thinking about what's the possibility here? What's the positive here? But you know, when it comes to relationships, seeing the positive in relationships, it means you're going to have to become, if you're going to focus on the positive, it means you're going to have to become a kind and forgiving person. Just like Jesus was. Look how Ephesians 4 says it. I think we've looked at this verse almost every week during this series. Instead, be kind to each other, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, just as God through Christ forgave you. If we're going to focus on the positive, we'll have to forgive. Now, we have the opportunity in life to be critical and judgmental. We have the opportunity in life to be the kind of person who walks around and smugly just thinks that we're better than everybody else. But I'm telling you, that's not how you get influence. How you get influence is by forgiving. It's by, on a regular basis, forgiving people even when they don't ask for it. That's how you get influence. I think about the first pastor that I worked with when I was a young man, a young pastor. My pastor, he had a number of people on his board who were former alcoholics. People that had a life slavery to alcohol. And yet they found Jesus and they've become completely free of this. And I noticed these guys had an incredible devotion to my pastor. I just couldn't quite figure it out. I remember one night, it was late, I was on a long drive with one of the board members, one of the people who had a story like this. And he was talking in such glowing terms about the pastor. And finally, I just asked the question. I was probably 22, 23 years old. And I said, well, tell me, why is it that you are so loyal and love our pastor so much? What has happened? And he said, it was because when my life was trash, and my life was going nowhere, our pastor said to me, this is not the end of your life. You've got a great future coming. Now, I tell you that, and they told that story. I mean, different ones would tell the same story over and over. I'm saying that to you because the reason, how did he get influence? He looked to the positive. You want to get influence with others? It's not by complaining. It's by looking to the positive and pointing to it. You want influence with your spouse? Look to the positive and mention it often. You want influence with your kids? Stop telling them everything they've ever done wrong and start pointing out the positive. Now, the next two things here, they're connected to this. And that is, when we focus on the positive, we got to focus on their potential. Do you know everybody has a God-given potential? Everybody has gifts from God. Did you know that? Look at look at 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 10. God has given each of you a gift. So even the people you don't like have a gift from God. And so one way to influence others is to figure out what their God-given gifts are and to kind of shine that up. Kind of point to it often. Focus on their potential. And I'll just say this. Often when people have great potential, they are difficult. They got a bunch of other baggage. They're difficult to get along with. I think about a student of mine who I planted a church with. Guy was bright. He's good looking. He'd accomplished some other things. But do you know what? There were some really hard things to like about him. He would be overly direct. And he would be brash. And he would write people off. He would burn the bridge all the time with other people. And I just thought, man, how is this ever going to get turned around? And I would feel friction with him. But what I tried to do was to keep my eye on his potential, who he could become, who it was that God had made him to be. And you know what? Some of you, you're in difficult relationships with somebody. And it's not yet what it's going to be, your relationship with them. And I'm telling you, you want to influence like Jesus in that relationship? Then figure out how you can focus on their potential. Related to this is the next one, and that is to focus on their purpose. Focus on their purpose. God's made everybody with a purpose. And here's the thing. Every relationship that matters to you, it's going to be tested. And the way that you keep that relationship going, whether it's with a spouse who's let you down, or a child who's let you down, or a friend or a business associate who's let you down, it's to turn your eyes to purpose. It's to say, okay, what is the purpose that God has given to this person, and what is the purpose of this relationship from God's point of view in my life? When you can keep your eyes on purpose, you can keep a relationship going in the right direction. When you can keep your eyes on purpose, you can influence others in a positive way, like Jesus did. Fifth, focus on their process. Focus on their process. And so what am I saying here? I'm saying that everybody's in a process. Nobody fixes all their issues overnight. Nobody throws all the stones out of the bag overnight. Everybody's a mixed bag, and it's going to be that way for a long time. It takes, the process in life takes a long time. Some of you, you're in a relationship with someone, and you are ready to give up. And I'm saying to you, wait. God's got a process here. And sometimes, even like with Peter, that process is going to involve some pain. That process might involve disappointment. That process might involve betrayal. But there's a process. Processes that are headed towards someplace good. And the reason why I'm talking to you about this today, the reason why I'm trying to encourage you, become a person of positive influence, influence like Jesus influences. The reason why I'm talking to you about this is because this is the way that God has designed it, that relationships pay you back with life. You say, well, why do you say that? How do you say that so? I want you to look at something with me. And that's in Luke chapter 6. Jesus' words. He says, give and you will receive. Now, maybe you've heard that verse and you've heard this before and you've been in church and you're like, wait a second, are you going to take an offering now? No, I'm not going to take a third offering. But this is not about money. Do you know the words that come right before this? I mean, verse 37, you should look it up in your Bible. I'll tell you what it says. Luke 6:37, right before Jesus says, give and you will receive, he says, do not judge others or you'll be judged. Do not condemn, or it will all come back against you. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. So give, and you will receive. This is about relationships. This is about how you're going to get along with others. This is about whether or not you're going to forgive and be kind. This is about whether or not you're going to remain committed to your relationship even when you're unhappy with the other person. What does he say? Give and you will receive. Your gift will return to you in full. The more that you forgive, the more you put the other person in front of yourself, the more you focus on their needs instead of your own, the more that you look over and let go things that have disappointed you, the more it's going to pay you back. He says it'll come back to you in full pressed down, shaken together, to make room for more, running over and poured into your lap. And then he says this, the amount you give will determine the amount you get back. You want more joy in your life? Then start forgiving like Jesus forgives. You want to be more fulfilled in your life? You want to be happier with the people who've let you down? Then start forgiving and loving like Jesus did. Because I'm telling you, the amount you give in your relationships, the amount that you invest in people, that's the amount that you'll get back. And that's influencing like Jesus. The best way to love somebody, it's to help them to become the person, the best version of who they are. Invest in them, and they'll invest back in you. I remember it was 2006, spring of 2006. It's in mid-May. We had a grand opening for church we were opening in the Netherlands. Our executive pastor, he was there. It was an amazing day. Hundreds of people showed up. These things don't happen often in Europe. It was such a big deal. Even the television news from Amsterdam showed up. I mean, it was an amazing day. And I didn't realize exactly what was happening, but there was a man in the crowd, and he had arranged to take me to lunch with my friend who planted the church with me. And he takes us to lunch, and his name's Billy Hornsby. And I didn't know, I knew who he was, but I don't imagine you know who he is. Billy Hornsby, he was a church planter, and he's somebody who inspired the planting of many of the greatest churches in America. And he had planted churches in Europe as well as in America. He could have been the pastor of like a huge church, I'm sure of it. But he focused on inspiring people and raising up other leaders to plant churches. And I couldn't believe, that he was there that day that our church was opening, and we went to lunch and we talked about, wow, what does this mean, and how could we expand on this one place to be able to see churches like this planted all over Europe? It was an amazing conversation. A couple years later, I felt privileged to meet a legend like that. To me, he's a legend. And a couple years later, he was dying. His life was coming to an end because of cancer. People showed up from all over the world to his hotel room, or to his hospital room, to visit him and to express their appreciation of him. There are hundreds and probably thousands of churches around the world that were planted because of his influence. And I heard about these words from him, and I just want for you to take it home with you. Maybe you could write it down somewhere. But he's laying there dying, and somebody said, Billy, what's your greatest accomplishment? And he said these words. He said, my greatest accomplishments are someone else's. My greatest accomplishments are someone else's. Friends, that's what the influence of Jesus looks like. That's what the love of Jesus is centered on. It's centered on putting others first. And I'm telling you, if you're in relationships and it's all about your happiness and it's all about your satisfaction, you're not going to get the kind of satisfaction and joy you're looking for. You've got to ask God to change your mind and heart and to start influencing like Jesus does.